Henry Ashford hadn't heard his sons laugh in 3 years, not because they couldn't make sound, but because he'd never been close enough to see their silent joy. Standing frozen in his kitchen doorway, watching a scene that shattered what remained of his heart, Henry finally understood what he'd lost. Rosa, the 30-year-old African-American maid he'd hired 6 weeks ago and barely noticed, moved across the marble floor in exaggerated sweeps that created vibrations his 4-year-old deaf twins could feel through their bare feet. Bennett and Elliot's faces glowed with pure, breathless happiness as they copied her movements, their tiny bodies bouncing with excitement, mouths open in that raw sound deaf children make when overwhelmed with emotion. Real laughter. Genuine joy. The kind Henry hadn't witnessed since the night his Mercedes crashed into that intersection, killing his wife and stealing his son's hearing forever. If this father's heartbreak is hitting you deep, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Let's build a community of people who understand that some losses can't be measured in dollars. The kitchen smelled like vanilla and cinnamon. Flower handprints decorated the counter. Crayon drawings covered the refrigerator. Wooden spoons lay abandoned in mixing bowls. This sterile showpiece that cost $400,000 to design suddenly looked lived in, warm, like an actual home instead of a museum for his guilt. Rosa spun Elliot in a circle and the boy's whole body shook with silent laughter. Bennett clapped frantically, completely unaware his father stood 10 feet away, watching the childhood he'd purchased therapists and specialists to provide but never thought to create himself. 3 years of the finest experts money could summon. Speech therapists from Switzerland. Audiologists from Tokyo. Experimental treatments at Johns Hopkins. He'd written checks that could fund hospital wings, transformed an entire section of his mansion into a state-of-the-art therapy center, hired rotating teams of professionals who documented every milestone in clinical language. But none of them, not one, had made his son smile like this woman did while baking cookies and dancing in his kitchen. Rosa sensed his presence and stopped mid-spin. The twins turned to see what caught her attention, and Henry watched the light drain from their faces in real time. Their bodies went rigid. Elliot stepped backward, closer to Rosa's legs. Bennett's hands dropped to his sides. They weren't just cautious or shy. They were afraid of him. His own sons looked at their father the way small animals look at predators, calculating escape routes, every muscle tensed for survival. Henry tried to smile, tried to sign the greeting his expensive therapists had taught him, but his hands felt thick and clumsy. The gesture came out wrong, jerky and unnatural, nothing like Rosa's fluid movements. Bennett's eyes widened, then he grabbed his brother's hand. Rosa signed something quick and confident to the boys. Both twins bolted from the kitchen without a backward glance, their small feet slapping against hardwood as they raced toward the stairs. Henry listened to those footsteps fade, each one another nail in the coffin of his failure as a father. "What did you tell them?" His voice came out rougher than intended, sharp with pain that had nowhere else to go. Rosa met his gaze without flinching. She had intelligent brown eyes that carried depth and warmth, the kind of presence that made people feel genuinely seen. There was no defiance in her expression, but rather a quiet strength that made Henry feel small despite the 8-figure balance in his checking account. "I told them you wouldn't understand." Her voice was gentle but firm. "I told them to go play upstairs where it's safe." Safe. The word twisted in Henry's gut like a blade. Safe from what? From him? From their own father who donated $75 million to deaf education programs, funded an entire research wing at Children's Hospital, hired every specialist who'd promised even marginal improvement. Safe from the man who'd spent 3 years trying to buy back what his negligence had stolen. Rosa walked past him with purpose, heading toward the hallway that led to the twins' bedroom. She moved like someone who belonged here, who had earned the right to comfort his children while he stood useless and unwanted. "Wait." Henry's voice cracked. "Please. I need to know how you did that. How you made them." He couldn't finish the sentence. "Made them happy. Made them feel safe. Made them look like children instead of tiny wounded creatures existing in a billionaire's fortress of guilt." Rosa paused but didn't turn around. Her shoulders rose and fell with a deep breath, as if deciding whether he deserved an answer. Finally, she faced him, and the expression on her face made Henry want to disappear. It was pity. "Mr. Ashford, those boys don't need another specialist. They don't need more therapy or fancier technology." Her words fell like hammers, each one breaking something inside him. They need someone who sees them as whole, not broken. Someone who doesn't look at them like they're a mistake that needs fixing. They need a parent who can be present, not just present their credit card. She turned away, leaving him standing alone in the kitchen that smelled like vanilla and cinnamon, surrounded by evidence of an afternoon he hadn't been part of. Slowly, as if moving through water, Henry walked to the refrigerator. Among the therapy schedules and specialist appointment cards held up by expensive magnets, he saw something new. A crayon drawing. His hands shook as he pulled it free. The paper was cheap construction paper, the kind from dollar stores, not the premium art supplies he'd ordered from boutique shops. 3 stick figures held hands across the bottom of the page. The middle figure wore a blue triangle dress and had brown scribbles for hair, Rosa. On either side were smaller figures, one with a messy red blob for a shirt, the other with green. Bennett always wore red. Elliot always wore green. But what made Henry's knees buckle was the 4th figure, drawn separate from the others, isolated on the right side of the page with a thick black line dividing him from the family. The figure wore a dark suit and stood alone, disconnected, untouched. Above the drawing, in Bennett's shaky 4-year-old handwriting, were 2 words that destroyed what was left of Henry's composure. My family. His sons had drawn their family, and he wasn't part of it. Henry's vision blurred. The drawing crumpled slightly in his grip as his legs gave out and he sank to the floor, his $3,000 suit pressing against cold marble. 3 years of writing checks, scheduling appointments, building therapy centers, and funding research programs. 3 years of trying to buy redemption, purchase forgiveness, bankroll his way back to being the father he'd never actually been. And his 4-year-old sons had just shown him the truth in crayon and construction paper. He'd purchased everything except what mattered. He'd lost them. Not to the accident. Not to the deafness. To his own inability to be what they needed, a father who could love them in their silence instead of desperately trying to buy back the sound. The drawing slipped from his fingers and drifted to the floor. Henry pressed his palms against his eyes, but it didn't stop the tears that came in raw, gasping waves. He cried the way he hadn't allowed himself to cry since the night he'd stood in a hospital corridor while doctors explained that his wife was gone and his sons would never hear again. He cried until his throat burned and his chest ached and the expensive kitchen tile felt like the only real thing in his billion-dollar fortress of failure. Upstairs, a door closed softly. The twins, being tucked into bed by a woman they'd known for 6 weeks. Another routine he'd outsourced. Another moment he'd purchased himself out of. Henry didn't know how long he sat there on the floor, holding that drawing like it was evidence in his trial. The light through the kitchen windows shifted from afternoon gold to evening amber. Somewhere in the house, he heard water running, Rosa giving the boys their bath. She knew which twin liked which temperature. Knew that Bennett needed his rubber duck and Elliot wouldn't wash his hair without the special shampoo that didn't sting his eyes. Details Henry had never learned because he'd hired people to learn them for him. Finally, when his legs felt stable enough, Henry pushed himself upright. He smoothed the wrinkles from the drawing with trembling fingers and studied it again. The black line separating him from his sons might as well have been the Grand Canyon. But as he stared at that crude crayon barrier, something shifted in his chest. Not hope exactly, hope felt too fragile. It was something harder. More desperate. Determination. He needed to understand what Rosa saw that he'd been blind to, what she knew that all his expensive specialists had missed. And he needed to know who this woman really was, this person who'd walked into his home and earned his son's trust in less than 2 months while he'd spent 3 years becoming a stranger to them. Henry pulled his phone from his pocket and opened his secure files. Rosa Martinez. Age 30. Previous employment references all checked out. Background screening had been flawless. But now, studying the sparse details of her application, something felt incomplete. The gaps in her employment history. The vague references. The fact that she'd accepted a position paying $70,000 annually when her qualifications, degrees in early childhood development and special education, could have earned her twice that anywhere else. People didn't take massive pay cuts without a reason. If you're still watching, don't miss what happens next. Comment below where you're from and let's connect. His finger hovered over his private investigator's contact information. One call and he'd have everything, her complete history, her motivations, her secrets. It was what he always did when he needed information. Buy it. Command it. Control it. But Rosa's words echoed in his memory, they need someone who sees them as whole, not broken. Henry closed the phone and slipped it back into his pocket. Tomorrow he'd find out who Rosa Martinez really was, but not by hiring investigators. He'd ask her himself. He'd sit down, actually be present instead of just present his resources, and listen to whatever truth she had to give him. Tonight, though, he had something more important to do. Carrying the drawing like a sacred object, Henry climbed the stairs toward the twins' bedroom. Each step felt heavier than the last, weighted with 3 years of absence disguised as provision. Outside their door, he paused. Through the wood, he heard Rosa's soft voice. She must be reading them a story, though he knew they couldn't hear her. He could picture them watching her face, reading her expressions, feeling the vibrations of her voice through wherever they were pressed against her. The scene he imagined gutted him because it was something he'd never done. Never sat with them for bedtime stories. Never learned how to communicate comfort through touch and vibration and facial expression. Never been the safe place they ran to when scared. He raised his hand to knock, then stopped. What would he say? What could he possibly communicate that would bridge the canyon between him and the 2 small boys on the other side of that door? The answer came from the crumpled drawing still clutched in his other hand. Nothing. He couldn't say anything tonight because words, signed or spoken, weren't the problem. The problem was everything words represented. The therapy appointments. The specialist consultations. The expensive equipment. The desperate, guilt-driven attempts to fix what he perceived as broken instead of loving what was beautifully whole. Henry lowered his hand without knocking. He couldn't go in there tonight. Not yet. Not until he figured out how to be someone worth including in that crayon drawing. He turned away from the door and walked to his study, where he kept files on every specialist who'd ever treated Bennett and Elliot. Thick folders detailing every therapy session, every test result, every incremental milestone. He'd memorized these reports, used them to guide decisions about treatment plans and intervention strategies. Now, as Henry spread them across his desk under the amber glow of his reading lamp, they looked different. Clinical. Cold. Full of data about his sons but empty of anything that might help him actually know them. He reached for the bottom drawer where he kept the things he couldn't bear to look at, photos from before the accident. His wife's smile. The twins as newborns. Family vacations to places with names he could barely remember. And there, underneath the photo albums, was something he'd forgotten he'd saved. His wife's journal. The leather cover was soft with age, the pages filled with her neat handwriting. Henry's hands shook as he opened it randomly, landing on an entry from 6 months before the accident. Henry missed bedtime again tonight. I know the Singapore deal is important, but Bennett asked me 3 times when Daddy would be home. I didn't know what to tell him. How do you explain to a 1-year-old that his father loves him but loves his empire more? The words punched the air from Henry's lungs. He flipped to another entry, then another, each one revealing the same pattern. His wife documenting his absence. His sons asking for a father who was always somewhere else, building wealth they didn't need while missing moments that could never be reclaimed. Henry closed the journal and pressed it against his chest, as if the physical pressure could somehow ease the pain radiating through his entire body. The truth had always been there, written in his wife's careful script. He'd been an absent father before the accident. The tragedy hadn't created the distance between him and his sons. It had just given him a more convenient excuse to maintain it. His phone buzzed with an email marked urgent, something about tomorrow's board meeting, a vote that could cost or earn him another $100 million depending on which way things went. His finger moved automatically toward the notification, 3 years of habit guiding his attention to business, to empire building, to everything except what actually mattered. Then he stopped. Henry deleted the email without reading it. He opened a new message to his executive board and began typing. Effective immediately, I'm taking a 6-month leave of absence. All urgent matters should be directed to the CFO. This is non-negotiable and begins tomorrow. He hit send before he could second-guess himself. Because his sons had drawn a picture that showed the truth, he wasn't part of their family. And if he wanted to earn his way back into that crayon drawing, past that black line his 4-year-old had used to separate him from everyone who mattered, he'd have to do something he'd never done in his entire life. Put them first. As Henry climbed into bed that night, he heard soft footsteps in the hallway. His door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, he saw Rosa pause outside the twins' room, checking on them one last time before heading to her own quarters. She moved with such natural care, such genuine love for 2 children who weren't even hers. The contrast to his own sterile relationship with Bennett and Elliot was devastating. Tomorrow, Henry decided, everything would change. Tomorrow he'd ask Rosa to teach him how to be present in his son's silent world. Tomorrow he'd learn their routines, their preferences, their fears and joys. Tomorrow he'd start the painful journey of becoming the father those 2 boys deserved instead of the checkbook they'd learned to fear. But tonight, lying in his bed in a mansion that felt more like a mausoleum, Henry Ashford faced the hardest truth of his life. He was a billionaire who'd lost the only treasures that mattered. And no amount of money could buy back the 3 years he'd wasted being absent while pretending to provide. The crayon drawing sat on his nightstand, that black line mocking him in the darkness. But as Henry closed his eyes, he made himself a promise, the same promise his wife had written that he'd made the day his sons were born, the one he'd broken 1,000 times over. This time, he wouldn't fail them. This time, he'd learn what it meant to be their father, not their financier. This time, love would be measured in presence, not presents. And if it took the rest of his life to erase the black line his son had drawn, then that's exactly what he'd give. Henry woke to silence, the same silence that had defined his home for 3 years, but this morning it felt different. Heavier. More deliberate. He'd barely slept, Rosa's words replaying endlessly, they need someone who sees them as whole, not broken. By 7 o'clock, he'd positioned himself outside the twins' bedroom door, listening to the morning routine happening without him. Soft footsteps. The creak of the toy chest opening. That raw sound Bennett made when excited about something. All of it managed by Rosa while Henry stood in the hallway like an intruder in his own home. When Rosa finally emerged, she startled at seeing him there. Mr. Ashford. The boys are getting dressed. Did you need something? I need to talk. Henry's voice was rough from crying. About why you're really here. About what you're not telling me. Rosa's expression shifted, something between resignation and relief, as if she'd been waiting for this confrontation. The study. 10 minutes. Let me finish with the boys first. Those 10 minutes stretched like hours. Henry paced his study, Catherine's journal still open on his desk from last night's reading. When Rosa finally entered and closed the door behind her, her usual composure had cracked. She looked tired. Vulnerable. Human in ways he'd never noticed before. You want the truth? Rosa sat without being invited, her hands folded in her lap. Fine. I had a daughter. Alicia. She went deaf at 3 years old from bacterial meningitis. The revelation hit Henry like cold water. You never mentioned. I know what your background check found, Mr. Ashford. I know you saw the sanitized version of my life. But you didn't dig deep enough to see the gaps. Rosa's eyes glistened. I was a single mother working 3 jobs. Couldn't afford the specialists, the therapy, the equipment you throw money at without thinking. I did everything I could with nothing, and it still wasn't enough. Henry sank into his chair. What happened to her? She died at 6. Rosa's voice cracked but didn't break. Another infection. One I missed because I was so exhausted from trying to keep us afloat that I didn't notice the symptoms until it was too late. By the time I got her to the emergency room, her fever was so high, she stopped, composing herself. I held her while she died. She was the same age your boys would have been if the accident hadn't happened. The connection made terrible sense. So you came here to save them because you couldn't save her. Like and subscribe, this revelation changes everything about why this family needed healing. I came here because when I saw your job posting 6 weeks ago, mentioning deaf 4-year-old twin boys, I knew it wasn't coincidence. Rosa met his gaze directly. I needed to make sure these children got everything Alicia never had. I needed to prove that deaf children can thrive if someone actually sees them as complete human beings instead of problems to solve. You lied on your application. Henry's tone wasn't accusatory, just factual. I omitted. There's a difference. Rosa stood, moving to the window. If I'd told you about Alicia, you would have rejected me. Thought I was too emotionally compromised, too personally invested. You would have hired some sterile professional who checked boxes on paper but couldn't actually reach your sons. Henry wanted to argue, but she was right. He would have done exactly that. So for 6 weeks, you've been using my children as therapy for your grief? Rosa whirled on him, and for the first time, he saw real anger. No. I've been giving your sons what you refused to, actual presents. I bake with them because Alicia loved baking. I dance with them because vibration was how my daughter experienced music. I see them as whole because that's what they are. Her voice dropped. You look at Bennett and Elliot and see broken children who need fixing. I look at them and see my daughter's second chance. The words landed like physical blows. Henry thought of the crayon drawing, the black line separating him from his family. They're afraid of me. They don't know you. Rosa's anger softened into something sadder. Mr. Ashford, when's the last time you sat on the floor and played with them? When's the last time you learned what makes them laugh, what frightens them, what they dream about in that silent world you're so desperate to change? Henry couldn't answer because the answer was never. He'd never done any of those things. I watch you throw money at specialists who document their progress like they're research subjects instead of children, Rosa continued. I watch you schedule therapy sessions but never attend them. You've built them a world-class treatment center in this mansion, but you don't know that Bennett is terrified of the sensory room or that Elliot won't use the speech equipment because it makes his throat hurt. Each revelation was another nail in Henry's coffin of failure. How do you know all this? Because I asked them. Because I pay attention. Because I'm present. Rosa moved back to her chair, suddenly looking as exhausted as Henry felt. Your sons need a father, Mr. Ashford. Not a financier. Not a guilt-ridden executor of their mother's memory. A father who can love them in their silence instead of mourning the sound they'll never make. The echo of her words from yesterday. Henry pulled out the crayon drawing from his desk drawer, spreading it flat between them. They drew this. Put you in their family and me outside it. Rosa studied the picture, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. Because that's the truth they live every day. Subscribe now before you miss how this broken father begins his journey back. Teach me. Henry's voice broke. Please. Teach me how to be what they need. I don't know how to talk to them, how to comfort them, how to be anything other than the man who signs checks and schedules appointments. But I want to learn. I need to learn. Rosa wiped her eyes, studying him with an expression he couldn't read. Why now? Why after 3 years of absence do you suddenly care? Because yesterday I watched my sons laugh for the first time since the accident, and I realized they could do that without me. Because I read my dead wife's journal and discovered I was failing them long before the crash. Because my 4-year-old drew a picture that showed me I'm not even part of their world. Henry's hands trembled. Because I don't want to spend the rest of my life separated from them by that black line. Silence stretched between them. Outside the study, Henry heard the twins playing, that rhythmic thumping they made to create vibrations they could feel. Life happening without him, the way it had been happening for 3 years. It won't be easy, Rosa said finally. They don't trust you. You'll have to earn every tiny fragment of connection. It could take months. Years. And there's no guarantee they'll ever let you in. I don't care how long it takes. You'll have to be present. Actually present. Not checking your phone during their playtime. Not scheduling calls during meals. Not treating them like an item on your to-do list. I took a 6-month leave from the company last night. Sent the email at midnight. Henry showed her his phone, dozens of messages from board members, all ignored. I meant what I said. I'm done being absent. Rosa studied him for a long moment, weighing his sincerity. There's something else you need to understand. Your sons are happy the way they are. They've built a rich life in their silence. They don't feel broken or incomplete. The only broken thing in their world is their relationship with you. The observation cut deep because it was true. Henry had spent 3 years viewing his son's deafness as a tragedy to overcome when they'd actually adapted beautifully. The tragedy wasn't their silence, it was his inability to exist in it with them. So where do we start? Henry asked. Rosa stood, moving toward the door. We start with you spending today with Bennett and Elliot. No phone. No work. No distractions. Just you trying to exist in their world. She paused at the threshold. And Mr. Ashford? When you inevitably fail, and you will fail, don't give up. Because that's what they're expecting. Another adult who tries briefly then abandons them when it gets hard. I won't abandon them. We'll see. Rosa opened the door. They're in the playroom. Go introduce yourself to your sons. Actually introduce yourself, not as the man who pays for things, but as someone who wants to know them. Henry followed her into the hallway, his heart hammering. At the playroom door, he paused. Through the gap, he could see Bennett and Elliot building something with blocks, completely absorbed in their silent world. Rosa touched his shoulder gently. One more thing. I know you found my background incomplete because I hid the parts about Alicia. But you should know something else. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. My daughter died asking me, in sign language, why mommy couldn't make her better. I've lived with that question for 2 years. Don't let your sons grow up asking why daddy couldn't love them. She walked away, leaving Henry alone at the threshold of his son's world. He took a deep breath and pushed the door open. 2 small faces turned toward him, their expressions shifting instantly from joy to wariness. Bennett signed something quick to Elliot. Henry caught the gesture but didn't understand the words. Both boys stood, preparing to flee like they always did. But this time, Henry didn't try to sign a greeting. Didn't try to speak. Instead, he simply walked to where they'd been building and sat down on the floor. Cross-legged. At their level. Vulnerable and uncertain. He picked up a block and held it out to Elliot, a question, an offering, a plea. For endless seconds, his son stared at him. Then Elliot looked at Bennett, some silent communication passing between them that Henry couldn't interpret. Finally, slowly, Elliot took the block. It wasn't trust. It wasn't forgiveness. It was barely even acknowledgement. But it was a beginning. Like and subscribe to witness a father's painful journey toward redemption. And as Henry sat there on the playroom floor, holding blocks while his sons decided whether he was worth including in their world, he felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Hope. The block sat between them like a test. Elliot had taken it from Henry's outstretched hand, but now what? Henry watched his son turn the wooden cube over in his small fingers, examining it as if searching for hidden meaning. Bennett remained several feet away, arms crossed, watching his father with those impossibly perceptive eyes that seemed to catalog every failure. Henry had no script for this moment. No therapy manual. No specialist standing nearby to guide him through the proper protocol for connecting with deaf children. Just him, sitting cross-legged on a playroom floor, trying to figure out how to exist in his son's world. Elliot placed the block on top of the structure he and Bennett had been building. Then he looked at Henry expectantly, signing something quick. Henry had no idea what it meant. His expensive sign language tutor had taught him basic words: hello, eat, sleep, bathroom, but not whatever his 4-year-old son was asking right now. I don't understand, Henry said aloud, immediately realizing how useless spoken words were. He shook his head slowly, hoping the gesture translated. Elliot's face fell. He turned to Bennett and signed rapidly, their silent conversation excluding Henry completely. Bennett responded with sharp, frustrated movements, then both boys turned their backs on their father and returned to building without him. Dismissed. Rejected. Irrelevant. Henry sat there for 10 minutes, watching his sons play in perfect synchronization. They communicated through signs he couldn't read, through touches and facial expressions that carried meaning he'd never learned to interpret. They existed in a complete world that didn't need him and never had. Rosa appeared in the doorway, observing silently. She didn't intervene, didn't translate, didn't rescue him from this painful lesson in humility. This was what he'd asked for, immersion in his son's reality without the buffer of money or expertise. I don't know what I'm doing, Henry admitted, his voice hollow. Good, Rosa said simply. That's where learning begins. She entered the room and knelt beside the twins, signing something that made both boys look at their father again. I told them you want to learn their language. That you're trying. What were they saying before? When Elliot gave me the block. He asked what color tower you wanted to build. Red or blue? You didn't answer, so they assumed you weren't really interested in playing with them. Rosa's tone held no judgment, just facts. Like and subscribe, this father's painful education is just beginning. Henry's chest tightened. His son had asked him a simple question and he'd failed to respond, confirming every assumption the boys had about their father's inability to connect. Can you teach me the basics? Please. Rosa spent the next hour drilling Henry on fundamental signs. Colors. Numbers. Simple requests. His hands felt thick and clumsy, his movements stiff where hers flowed naturally. The twins watched with varying degrees of interest. Elliot seemed cautiously curious, Bennett openly skeptical. When Rosa finally stepped back, Henry tried again. He signed to Elliot, clumsily, slowly, asking about the red tower. His son's eyes widened in surprise. Then, carefully, Elliot signed back, showing Henry where to place the next block. It was the smallest victory imaginable. One block placed correctly. One moment of successful communication. But Henry's eyes burned with tears because it felt like scaling Everest. They built for 20 minutes. Henry following Elliot's signed instructions, getting most of them wrong, but trying. Bennett eventually joined, still wary, but apparently deciding his father was harmless enough to tolerate. When the tower finally stood complete, lopsided and precarious, both boys clapped their hands in that exaggerated way deaf children do, creating vibration they could feel. Henry clapped too, mirroring their joy. For just a moment, he was part of their world instead of hovering outside it. Then his phone buzzed in his pocket. The sound was subtle, but Henry's instinctive reach toward his pocket was not. Both twins saw the movement and their faces changed instantly. The wariness returned. The walls went back up. Bennett signed something sharp to Elliot and both boys stood, walking away from their father toward the toy shelf on the opposite side of the room. "What did he say?" Henry asked Rosa, his hand frozen halfway to his pocket. "He said, Daddy's work is more important. He said it's always more important." Rosa's expression was unreadable. "That's what they've learned in 4 years of life, Mr. Ashford. That you'll start to engage, then something on that phone will pull you away. Every single time." Henry pulled out the phone. 17 missed calls. 32 emails. Text messages from board members, investors, partners, all marked urgent. His entire empire demanding his attention, his expertise, his decision-making. The quarterly earnings call started in an hour. The merger with the Singapore firm needed his final approval. The development project in Dubai required his signature by end of business. His old life, calling him back. He looked at his sons, now playing separately, having written him off again. Then at the phone in his hand, the device that had defined his priorities for 43 years. Henry turned off the phone completely. Not silent. Not vibrate. Off. Then he walked to the toy shelf, knelt beside Bennett and Elliot, and signed slowly, "I'm sorry. You are more important." Bennett stared at him, then signed something back. Rosa translated from across the room, "He doesn't believe you. He says you always leave. Then I'll prove him wrong." Henry settled onto the floor, positioning himself where the twins could see him clearly. "What are we playing?" Subscribe now before you miss this father's transformation from stranger to parent. The day crawled forward in painful increments. Rosa guided Henry through the twins' routine, lunch preparation, quiet time, afternoon activities. Every step revealed how little he knew about his own children. He made their sandwiches wrong. Elliot needed his cut in triangles, Bennett in squares. He'd never known there was a difference. He gave them the wrong cups. Bennett's red one had a chip that hurt his lip, information no specialist had documented because specialists weren't there during lunch. He attempted to read them a story but didn't know that Bennett needed to sit on the left where he could see facial expressions better, while Elliot needed to be close enough to feel vibrations from the reader's chest. 1,000 tiny details that defined his son's world, and Henry knew none of them. By afternoon, exhaustion set in. Not physical exhaustion, though his back ached from sitting on floors designed for children. Emotional exhaustion. The weight of watching his sons navigate life with grace and confidence while their father fumbled through the basics like a tourist in a foreign country. Rosa had been right. This wasn't going to be easy. It might not even be possible. At 4 o'clock, during what Rosa called vibration time, Henry watched her place a speaker on the floor and play music with heavy bass. The twins lay on their stomachs, feeling the sound waves pulse through their bodies, their faces peaceful and content. It was something they did every day. Something Henry had never witnessed because he was always in meetings during vibration time. "Can I try?" Henry asked Rosa. She nodded, stepping aside. Henry lay down beside his sons, mimicking their position. The bass thrummed through the floor, rhythmic and strong. This was how Bennett and Elliot experienced music, not through ears but through bones and skin, through the vibrations that connected them to sound in their own way. Elliot opened his eyes and saw his father lying next to him. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Then Elliot did something that shattered Henry completely. He reached out and took his father's hand. Not with trust. Not with love. Just with acknowledgement that his father was there, trying to exist in his world instead of forcing him to exist in another. Henry held his son's small hand, feeling the bass vibrate through both their bodies, and realized this was the most important thing he'd done in 3 years. Not the hospital wing he'd funded. Not the research grants. This. Lying on a floor, holding his son's hand, feeling music the way his child felt it. Bennett watched from 2 feet away, still guarded, still uncertain. But he didn't leave. He stayed close enough that Henry could reach out if invited, creating space for possibility even if he wasn't ready to trust it yet. When vibration time ended, Rosa helped the twins wash up for dinner. Henry stood in the playroom, his body aching and his heart raw, and looked at what they'd built together, that lopsided red tower, still standing despite its flaws. It wasn't much. One afternoon. A few successful moments buried in dozens of failures. His son still didn't trust him, still saw him as the man who'd always chosen work over them. But Elliot had taken his hand. Bennett had stayed close instead of leaving. They'd built a tower together, played on the floor together, felt music together through vibration instead of sound. Like and subscribe to witness the slow, painful healing of a broken family. As Henry headed toward the kitchen to help with dinner, another thing he'd never done, he passed the refrigerator and that crayon drawing with its black line. Tomorrow he'd ask Bennett if he could add himself to the picture. Not with money or grand gestures. Just by being there, consistently, proving through action that he meant what he'd signed earlier. You are more important. It would take months. Maybe years. Maybe forever. But for the first time since the accident that stole his wife and his son's hearing, Henry Ashford wasn't thinking about what money could buy or fix. He was thinking about how Elliot's hand felt in his, how Bennett's eyes watched him with something other than fear, how a lopsided tower built with patience and mistakes meant more than any business deal he'd ever closed. Tomorrow would bring new failures. New lessons in humility. New moments where his sons would remind him how far he had to go. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Henry would eat dinner with his children. He'd help clean up. He'd attempt bedtime routines he'd never learned. He'd fail at most of it. And he'd keep trying. Because that's what fathers do when they finally understand what matters. 3 weeks passed in a blur of failures and microscopic victories. Henry's hands ached from practicing sign language late into the night, his fingers forming shapes until muscle memory replaced conscious thought. His phone stayed off during the hours the twins were awake, though the pile of urgent messages grew into an avalanche his assistant warned could bury the company. Henry didn't care. He cared that Bennett finally let him prepare breakfast without supervision. He cared that Elliot had stopped flinching when Henry entered a room. He cared that the tower they built together each morning grew taller and more stable, a physical representation of something fragile being constructed between them. But trust remained elusive. The twins tolerated his presence now, sometimes even welcomed it, but they still ran to Rosa when hurt or scared or needing comfort. She remained their safe harbor while Henry was merely the man trying to dock at their shore. This morning, Henry woke before dawn with an idea that terrified him. He found Rosa in the kitchen preparing the twins' breakfast and asked her to take the day off. Absolutely not, Rosa said, not looking up from cutting fruit into precise shapes. You're not ready. I'll never be ready if you're always there to catch me. Henry poured himself coffee with hands that trembled slightly. One day. Just me and the boys. You can stay in the guest house, be available if there's an emergency, but let me try. Rosa set down her knife and studied him with those penetrating eyes that saw through every pretense. You'll fail. Multiple times. They'll cry. You'll panic. It will be a disaster. Probably. Henry met her gaze. But they need to see me fail and keep trying. They need to learn that I won't give up when it gets hard. After a long silence, Rosa nodded. One day. But if Elliot has a meltdown about his green cup and you can't handle it, I'm intervening. Deal. 2 hours later, Henry stood alone in the twins' bedroom, watching them sleep. Bennett curled on his side, thumb near his mouth though he no longer sucked it. Elliot sprawled across his bed, covers kicked off, one leg hanging over the edge. 4 years old. Completely dependent on the adults in their lives. And today, that adult would be their father with no backup plan. Henry gently touched Elliot's shoulder, the way Rosa had taught him, firm enough to wake but soft enough not to startle. Elliot's eyes opened slowly, found his father's face, and confusion flickered across his features. Where was Rosa? Good morning, Henry signed, the movement still clumsy but improving. Today, just us. Elliot sat up, immediately looking toward the door for Rosa. When she didn't appear, alarm replaced confusion. He signed something rapid that Henry only partially understood, something about where and Rosa and possibly scared. She's resting, Henry signed back, hoping he'd gotten the words right. I'm here. We'll have fun. Bennett woke to his brother's distress, and within seconds both twins were signing frantically to each other, their faces broadcasting panic that Henry was solely responsible for their care. The irony wasn't lost on him. His own sons were terrified of being alone with their father. Like and subscribe, this day will test everything this father has learned. Henry took a deep breath and knelt to their eye level. He signed slowly, clearly, I know you're scared. I'm scared too. But I want to take care of you today. Will you help me? The twins exchanged glances. Some silent communication passed between them that Henry couldn't interpret. Finally, Bennett signed back, breakfast. A test. Could their father handle the most basic task without Rosa's guidance? Yes, Henry signed. Breakfast. Show me what you want. The boys led him to the kitchen like tiny supervisors inspecting a new employee. Bennett pointed to the cabinet where Rosa kept their special bowls, the blue ones with raised edges that made eating easier. Elliot opened the refrigerator and pulled out the milk, then signed something Henry didn't catch. Slower, please, Henry signed. Elliot repeated the gesture more carefully. Cold. Not too cold. Henry had no idea milk temperature mattered, but he nodded and poured carefully, testing it against his wrist the way he'd seen Rosa do. The twins watched with clinical detachment, waiting for him to mess up. He didn't. Not with breakfast, anyway. The cereal was the right kind, the milk the right temperature, the fruit cut into the shapes they preferred. Bennett and Elliot ate in surprised silence, occasionally glancing at each other as if to confirm their father was actually succeeding. But success was temporary. After breakfast, Henry attempted to dress them for the day. He'd watched Rosa do this dozens of times, thought he understood the routine. But when he pulled out Elliot's clothes, the boy immediately started signing frantically, his face reddening with distress Henry couldn't decipher. What's wrong? Henry signed. Tell me slowly. Elliot pointed at the green shirt Henry had selected, then at the dresser, then back at the shirt. His small hands moved in rapid frustration that Henry couldn't follow. Within seconds, Elliot was crying, not the silent tears of sadness but the raw, keening sound deaf children make when overwhelmed by emotions they can't communicate. Henry's heart hammered. This was the meltdown Rosa had warned about. His instinct screamed to call for help, to let the expert handle it. But that's what he'd always done, handed off the hard parts to someone more qualified. Not today. Henry sat on the floor and pulled Elliot into his lap, even as the boy fought against him. He held firm but gentle, the way Rosa did during meltdowns, and began the rhythmic rocking motion that created vibrations Elliot could feel. He didn't try to sign or speak. Just held his son and rocked, letting the physical connection communicate what words couldn't. Slowly, Elliot's cries softened. His rigid body began to relax against Henry's chest. The meltdown didn't end quickly. It took 15 minutes of holding and rocking before Elliot finally calmed enough to pull back and look at his father. Henry signed carefully, I don't understand. Help me understand. Elliot climbed off his lap and went to the dresser, pulling out a different green shirt, one that looked identical to Henry's eyes but apparently had some crucial difference. He held both shirts up, signing something slow enough for Henry to catch, this one soft. That one itchy. Subscribe now to see a father finally learning what his sons need. Texture sensitivity. Something no specialist had mentioned in their clinical reports but something Rosa probably knew within days. Henry made a mental note to mark which clothes were soft and which were itchy, then helped Elliot dress in the acceptable shirt. Bennett had watched the entire exchange with calculating eyes. When his turn came to get dressed, he tested his father differently, signing that he wanted to wear his red shirt, the one Henry knew was in the laundry. Another test. Would Daddy give up? Make him wear something else? Call Rosa? Henry thought for a moment, then signed, "Red shirt is dirty. Should we wash it together so you can wear it tomorrow?" Bennett's eyebrows rose. This was apparently the correct answer. He nodded and led Henry to the laundry room, where they loaded his red shirt into the machine together. Henry let Bennett push the buttons to start it, and his son's face lit up with pride at being given a grown-up task. The morning progressed in a series of small crises and smaller victories. Henry discovered that Elliot needed exactly 3 ice cubes in his water, no more, no less. That Bennett would only brush his teeth if he could do it himself, while Henry pretended to brush his teeth too. That both boys had a mid-morning snack time that couldn't be skipped without triggering irritability. 1,000 tiny details that comprised their daily lives, each one a piece of knowledge Henry should have gained years ago. By lunchtime, exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him. The constant vigilance required to communicate without verbal language, to read facial expressions and body language, to prevent meltdowns before they started, it was more draining than any board meeting he'd ever endured. But it was also more rewarding. After lunch, Henry attempted what Rosa called quiet time, an hour where the twins rested but didn't necessarily sleep. He'd seen her read to them during this time, using exaggerated facial expressions and movements to tell stories even though they couldn't hear her voice. Henry grabbed a picture book about space and settled on the couch with both boys. He opened the book and began, using his limited sign language to describe the pictures. His hands moved clumsily, his facial expressions felt forced, and he lost the narrative thread halfway through when he couldn't figure out how to sign astronaut. But Bennett and Elliot watched with rapt attention. Not because he was good at it, but because he was trying. Their father, who'd never read to them before, was sitting with a picture book making funny faces and awkward hand gestures in an effort to share a story. When he finished, badly, incompletely, Elliot signed, "Again." Henry's throat tightened. "Again? Really?" Both boys nodded. So he read it again, slightly better this time, catching details he'd missed. Then Bennett requested a different book, and they read that one too. By the 4th story, Henry's hands were cramping and his facial muscles ached from exaggerated expressions, but his sons were pressed against his sides, engaged and content. This was what he'd been missing. Not the milestone moments specialists documented, but the ordinary magic of reading stories on a Tuesday afternoon. Like and subscribe to witness a father discovering what wealth never bought. That evening, during dinner preparation, disaster struck. Henry was chopping vegetables while the twins played nearby when he heard it, the distinctive crash of breaking glass. He spun to find Elliot standing frozen, Bennett's blue bowl shattered on the kitchen floor, milk spreading across the tiles. Bennett's face crumpled. He began signing frantically, "Sorry, sorry, sorry, accident, sorry." Henry's first instinct was frustration, another mess to clean, another thing going wrong. But he looked at his 4-year-old son's terrified expression and realized Bennett was expecting anger. Expecting punishment. Expecting his father to prove he couldn't handle this day after all. Henry set down the knife and knelt in the spreading milk, signing clearly, "Accidents happen. You're okay. We clean it together." Bennett's signing stopped. He stared at his father with wide eyes, as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. When Henry simply started picking up large glass pieces, Bennett slowly knelt to help. Elliot joined them, and all three worked to clean the mess together. New rule: Henry signed when the floor was clean. No one gets angry about accidents. Okay. Both boys nodded, but Henry saw something shift in Bennett's expression. A tiny crack in the wall between them. His son had made a mistake and the world hadn't ended. His father had stayed calm, helped fix it, and moved on. It was such a small moment. A broken bowl. Spilled milk. 5 minutes of cleaning. But it mattered. That night, during the bedtime routine, Henry had fumbled through every evening for 3 weeks. Something unprecedented happened. He'd just finished reading the final story, a tale about a train that he'd signed so badly the boys had giggled at his mistakes, when Elliot climbed into his lap. Not for comfort from a nightmare. Not because Rosa was unavailable. Just because he wanted to. Henry froze, afraid to breathe and break whatever spell had led to this moment. Elliot curled against his chest, thumb near his mouth, his small body finally trusting enough to seek comfort from his father. Bennett watched from his bed, still cautious, still guarded. But he didn't protest. Didn't call for Rosa. Just observed this new development with careful consideration. Henry held Elliot, feeling his son's heartbeat against his chest, and realized he was crying. Silent tears running down his face because his 4-year-old son was letting him provide comfort. After 3 years of rejection and 3 weeks of grueling effort, this small gesture felt like winning the lottery. He carried Elliot to bed, tucked him in, and signed, "I love you," with hands that shook. Elliot signed back, "Love you too, Daddy." 3 words. 3 simple signs. The first time either twin had ever told him they loved him. Henry barely made it to the hallway before his legs gave out. He sat on the floor outside their room, pressing his palms against his eyes, trying to breathe through the overwhelming emotion threatening to drown him. Rosa found him there 20 minutes later. She didn't ask what happened. Just sat beside him in understanding silence until he could speak. "Elliot said he loves me," Henry whispered. "Just now. He signed it." "I know," Rosa said quietly. "I was watching from the doorway. Bennett still doesn't trust me. Bennett will take longer. He remembers more from before the accident. Remembers you being absent. He needs more proof." Rosa stood, offering Henry her hand. "But you did good today. Really good." Henry let her pull him to his feet. "I messed up the morning routine twice, burned lunch, and broke down crying at bedtime. And you stayed. You didn't give up or call for help or let your phone distract you." Rosa smiled. That's what they needed to see. Not perfection. Persistence. As Henry walked to his bedroom that night, he passed the refrigerator and Bennett's drawing. Tomorrow he'd ask if he could draw himself into that picture. Maybe Bennett would say yes. Maybe he'd say no. Maybe it would take another 3 weeks or 3 months before Henry earned that permission. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, one of his sons had told him, "I love you." And tomorrow, he'd keep trying to earn those words from the other. Because that's what fathers do when they finally understand what matters. 6 weeks into Henry's transformation, Rosa knocked on his study door holding something that made his breath catch, a dusty cardboard box labeled in his wife's handwriting, "For the boys when they're older." "Found this in the attic storage," Rosa said, setting it on his desk. "Thought you should see it before the twins do." Henry stared at Catherine's looping script, his hands trembling as he lifted the lid. Inside lay treasures he'd forgotten existed, the twins' hospital bracelets from birth, tiny footprints pressed in clay, their first onesies. Photographs of him holding 2 newborns, his face radiant with joy he barely remembered feeling. And beneath everything, a stack of sealed envelopes addressed to Bennett and Elliot, dated for their 18th birthdays. "May I?" Henry asked, though they were already in his hands. Rosa nodded. "She'd want you to read them." The first letter, written when the twins were 6 months old, began, "My darling boys, if you're reading this, I'm not there to tell you myself how much your daddy loves you. But I need you to know something important about the man who gave you life." Henry's vision blurred as he read Catherine's words describing him as a devoted father who rocked them through colicky nights, who sang off-key lullabies, who promised to be different from his own absent father. She wrote about his vow to prioritize family over fortune, to be present for every milestone, to teach them that a man's worth wasn't measured in bank accounts but in love given freely. "I don't recognize this person," Henry whispered, reading through tear-filled eyes. "When did I stop being him?" Rosa pulled up a chair. "When did the change happen? When did work consume you?" Henry flipped through more letters, watching Catherine's tone shift from hopeful to worried to resigned. By the twins' second birthday, she wrote, "Your father is building an empire, but I fear he's forgetting to build memories with you. I pray he remembers before it's too late." It had been too late. The accident happened before he could course-correct, leaving his sons with a father who'd broken every promise. "The boys should see this," Henry said, carefully gathering the photographs. "They should know their mother. Know there was a time when I kept my promises." That afternoon, Henry spread the contents across the living room floor. Bennett and Elliot approached cautiously, drawn by the photographs but uncertain about this unusual activity. Rosa stayed nearby, ready to translate if needed. Henry signed to them, "Your mama made this. She loved you very much. Want to see? Subscribe now, this moment will break your heart and rebuild it." The twins knelt beside the treasures. Elliot picked up a photo of Catherine pregnant, her hands on her swollen belly, smiling at the camera. He traced her face with one finger, then signed to Bennett, "Our mama was beautiful." Bennett found a picture of Henry holding both newborns, one in each arm, his expression suggesting he'd been handed the universe. The 4-year-old studied it intently, then looked at his father with confusion. He signed, "You look different. Happy." The observation cut deep. His son could see the transformation from joyful new father to the grief-hollowed man he'd become. "I was happy," Henry signed back. "Very happy. You both made me the happiest person alive." "What happened?" Bennett's small hands formed the question with heartbreaking directness. Henry reached for his wife's perfume bottle, kept in a box wrapped in tissue paper. He opened it carefully and let the twins smell it, the scent their mother had worn every day. Elliot's eyes widened with recognition he couldn't possibly have, some cellular memory of being held by the woman who'd carried him. "Mama died," Henry signed, his hands shaking. "In the accident. And I got very sad. So sad that I forgot how to be the happy daddy." Bennett picked up another photo, this one showing all 4 of them at the park, the twins barely walking, Catherine laughing at something off camera while Henry tickled Elliot. A moment of pure family joy frozen in time. "You forgot us?" Bennett signed, and the question destroyed Henry. "No. I never forgot you." Henry pulled both boys close, not caring if it was too soon or if they'd pull away. "But I forgot how to show you I love you. I forgot that being your daddy meant more than buying you things. Your mama knew that. She tried to teach me. But I didn't learn until it was too late." Elliot touched the photograph again, then signed something to Rosa. She translated, "He wants to know if you remember how to be happy now. Like and subscribe to see how memories can heal what grief destroyed." Henry looked at his sons, really looked at them. Elliot's trust had grown over 6 weeks of consistency. Bennett's walls were cracking, slowly, painfully. Neither boy would ever remember their mother, but they could learn about her through these artifacts. And maybe, through understanding who their father used to be, they could help him find his way back. "I'm learning," Henry signed. "You're teaching me. Every day, you show me what matters. And Mama," he touched the photograph, "she's teaching me too, through her words." Over the next hour, they explored the box together. Henry explained each item as best he could in his improving sign language. The hospital bracelets from when they were born. The first toy they'd shared. The blanket Catherine had knitted during pregnancy, blue on one side for boys but yellow on the reverse because she hadn't wanted to know their sex beforehand. Bennett found a sealed envelope with his name on it, marked for his 18th birthday. He tried to open it, but Henry gently stopped him. "From Mama," he signed. "For when you're older. She wrote special words just for you." But we wait. Save them for when you're grown. The disappointment on Bennett's face shifted to something else, wonder that his mother, who he'd never known, had thought about his future. Had loved him enough to write words meant to guide him through life. Did she write one for me? Elliot signed eagerly. Henry found the matching envelope. Yes. One for each of you. And, he discovered another, addressed to himself. One for me too. That night, after the twins were asleep and Rosa had retired to the guest house, Henry sat alone in his study and opened Catherine's letter to him. Her handwriting blurred through his tears as he read. My love, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And I'm so sorry I left you alone with our beautiful boys. I know you're scared. I know you're grieving. But please, Henry, don't let that grief steal you from Bennett and Elliot. They need their father, not perfect, just present. Remember the promises you made the night they were born. Keep them. Be the daddy you swore you'd be. Don't let my death be the reason you abandon the best parts of yourself. Our sons need you. Not your money. Not your empire. You. Please don't forget that. Please don't forget them. All my love, forever, Catherine. Henry folded the letter carefully and placed it in his wallet, next to the twins' latest school photos. Tomorrow he'd wake early and make their breakfast. He'd practice the new signs Rosa was teaching him. He'd spend vibration time on the floor with them, feeling music through bass instead of melody. He'd keep the promises he'd made and broken and was finally learning to honor. Like and subscribe, a father's journey toward redemption has just begun. Because Catherine had been right. The twins didn't need perfect. They needed present. And after 6 weeks of fumbling through fatherhood, Henry was finally beginning to understand the difference. The memory box sat open on his desk, filled with evidence of who he'd been before grief consumed him. Tomorrow, he'd show the boys more photos. More stories. More pieces of the mother they'd lost and the father he was working to become again. It wouldn't erase 3 years of absence. Wouldn't instantly heal the damage his neglect had caused. But it was a beginning. And beginnings, Henry had learned, were sometimes the hardest and most important steps of all. For months after Henry caught Rosa dancing with his sons, Bennett approached him in the kitchen holding that old crayon drawing, the one with the black line separating his father from the family. Daddy, Bennett signed, the gesture now natural, confident. Can I show you something? Henry knelt to his son's eye level, his heart already knowing what was coming but afraid to hope. Bennett pulled out a red crayon and carefully drew a line connecting Henry's isolated figure to the others. Then he added new details, flowers around their feet, a sun overhead, a house in the background. We're all together now, Bennett signed, his 4-year-old face serious. No more line. You stayed. Like and subscribe. After months of heartbreak, this family finds healing. Henry couldn't speak, couldn't sign, could barely breathe through the emotion flooding his chest. He pulled Bennett close, then called for Elliot, who came running from the playroom. Both boys wrapped their arms around their father, and for the first time since Catherine's death, Henry felt whole. Rosa watched from the doorway, tears streaming down her face. In 4 months, she'd witnessed a transformation that seemed impossible, a billionaire learning that presence mattered more than presence, that his sons didn't need to be fixed because they were never broken. I'm leaving next week, Rosa said that evening after the twins were asleep. My work here is done. Henry's stomach dropped. But the boys need you. I still need you. No, Rosa said gently. You needed me to show you how to see your sons. But now you know them better than anyone. You know that Bennett won't eat scrambled eggs on Tuesdays but loves them on Thursdays. That Elliot needs exactly 7 minutes of quiet time before bed. That they both still grieve their mother in ways they can't articulate. She smiled through tears. You don't need me anymore, Mr. Ashford. You've become the father they deserve. The realization hit Henry that Rosa had always been temporary, a bridge between his old life and the one he was finally living. "Where will you go?" "There's another family. Twin girls, age 5, both deaf. Their father just lost his wife and doesn't know how to connect with them." Rosa's expression was bittersweet. Someone who understands loss needs to show him what you learned, that grief isn't an excuse for absence. Henry understood. Rosa would spend her life honoring Alicia's memory by saving other deaf children from neglect. It was beautiful and heartbreaking in equal measure. On Rosa's last day, the twins clung to her, not understanding why she had to leave. Henry signed the explanation carefully. "Rosa helped Daddy learn how to be your daddy. Now she's going to help another daddy learn too. But we'll never forget her." Subscribe now to witness how one woman's grief saved an entire family. After Rosa left, the house felt different, quieter, even though it had always been silent. But Henry discovered he didn't need her guidance anymore. He'd internalized her lessons, made them his own. He woke early to prepare breakfast exactly how the boys liked it. He spent mornings teaching them new signs, afternoons in vibration time feeling music through their bodies, evenings reading stories with exaggerated expressions that made them laugh. His company survived without him, thrived even under leadership he'd been too controlling to trust before. He worked remotely now, for hours a day while the twins napped, then closed his laptop and returned to what mattered. One evening, 3 weeks after Rosa's departure, Henry carried the memory box to the living room. The twins gathered around as he pulled out Catherine's perfume bottle. "Want to hear about your mama?" he signed. Both boys nodded eagerly, settling against his sides. Henry told them everything. How Catherine laughed so hard she snorted, how she sang off-key in the shower, how she'd cried happy tears when the ultrasound revealed twins. He told them about her fierce love, her terrible cooking, her habit of dancing in the kitchen exactly like Rosa did. "She would be so proud of you both," Henry signed, his hands steady despite the tears. "And she would be proud that I finally learned what she tried to teach me, that you don't need to hear to be perfect. You just need to be loved." Elliot touched his father's face, wiping away tears. "We love you, Daddy." "I love you too," Henry signed back. "More than anything in this world." That night, after tucking the twins into their beds, Bennett's with the soft red sheets, Elliot's with the specific green blanket he couldn't sleep without, Henry stood in the doorway watching them sleep. 4-year-old boys who taught their billionaire father that wealth meant nothing compared to presence. Who'd shown him that broken things could be rebuilt if you were willing to do the work. Like and subscribe for stories that prove love transcends money and silence. Henry closed their door just a crack, the way Catherine used to do, and walked to his bedroom. On his nightstand sat the crayon drawing Bennett had revised, all of them connected now, the black line erased through love and persistence. He'd been a billionaire who'd lost everything that mattered. But his sons had given him a second chance, taught him to hear with his heart instead of his ears, to communicate through presence instead of purchases. Tomorrow they'd wake early and make pancakes together. Bennett would measure the flour while Elliot cracked eggs with intense concentration. They'd build another tower, this one taller and stronger than any before. They'd lie on the floor during vibration time, feeling music pulse through their bodies. They'd read stories and play games and exist together in the beautiful silence that had once terrified Henry but now felt like home. He wasn't a perfect father. He still made mistakes, still struggled with signs he should know, still occasionally reached for his phone during playtime before catching himself. But he was present. He was trying. And his sons knew, beyond any doubt, that their daddy loved them exactly as they were, deaf, perfect, whole. And in the end, that was the only wealth that mattered.